Okay, welcome back, everybody. We'd like to go to our next presenter, Dr. Thomas Seeley. He's going to talk to us a little bit about how a hive or a swarm chooses its new hive, new home. It's going to be an interesting topic. So, thank you, Doctor, for joining us today.
Okay, my pleasure. I'll share screen now. There we go. Share. And what did I go to here? Blow this up. Okay. Let me do a sound check. Are you and sight check? Are you seeing my first slide, and are you hearing my voice?
We're hearing your voice. Thank you.
Okay, and you're seeing the first slide?
Couple of forms. Yep, looks good.
Good. Okay, great. Thank you. Good to know. That's the hardest part of doing these presentations, getting started. Thank you for inviting me. It's my pleasure to be with you today and to share this talk about how honeybee swarm chooses its new home. It is an amazing process that the bees conduct when they choose their new home. It's always a delight for me to share it with you, share it with beekeepers. Let's do a little quick review of what our subject is. And I'm going to fix this up here, clear my screen a little bit. There we go. Swarm of bees. As we all know, it's a reproductive propagule of a honeybee colony, contains typically one queen bee and about 10,000 worker bees. Needs to find a protective home. It's hanging out in the open. It can't live there. It's got to find shelter. What you may not know is that there is a sizable, well, small fraction, tiny percentage really, of about 3% of the swarm consists of scout bees. These are the bees that have the responsibility of choosing the swarm's new home. And I don't show it here on the slide, but if you could look inside the brain of the bees that are functioning as scouts and compared the activity of the genes involved in learning, you would find that those genes are much more active in scout bees than in the other bees. And that makes a lot of sense because these scout bees go out and have to learn a lot of information about potential home sites. And that's what we're going to be looking at now. Let's see, time. What are these scout bees seeking? Well, these two images illustrate some of the things that are very important to the bees. One is the entrance, that it's being high off the ground and is small, only about 3 square inches. And they like the cavity to be spacious, not super spacious, but spacious enough. And as we'll see shortly, what they really like is a cavity that's somewhere around the size of one deep 10-frame hive body. That's 40 liters or about 10 gallons. Now, you might wonder, well, how do we know the housing preferences of honeybees? Well, we know it from work that I did quite a few years ago now, back in the 1970s, in which I set out nest boxes in pairs on things like power line poles or paired trees, and I would see which box was first occupied by a swarm. So here's an example where I gave asked the question, do the bees like a small entrance or do they accept an even rather large entrance opening? So 2.5 square inches or 12.5. And I would put up these boxes in pairs like this, many of them, and I would see which ones would be occupied first. And I did it with various variables, not just the entrance size, but the entrance height and so forth. And the results, what the bees showed me was based on their pattern of swarms moving into my test boxes, they showed me that they like a small entrance area. They like the entrance height to be 15 feet rather than 3 feet. They like the entrance directions southerly rather than northerly. They very much like the entrance location at the bottom of the cavity, the home site, rather than the top. They like the cavity size, as I've mentioned already, they prefer 10 gallons over 2.5 gallons, and they also preferred 10 gallons over 25 gallons. So something in the middle is what they like. And if they can find a cavity, a nesting cavity that comes pre-equipped with combs from a previous colony, they very much are attracted to that. So combs in the cavity are desired as well. Incidentally, to get the results that is shown under that preferences there, it was a huge endeavor. It required building 252 nest boxes because for each variable, like just entrance area, I built 12 pairs of boxes, one with, in each pair, one small entrance, one large entrance. I had to do that for all these variables. And some variables that I don't show you the results of because the bee said, we don't really care about that. Things like the shape, cavity shape. But that's another story. Let's look now at what a scout bee does, how she behaves when she's getting started in her activity and she finds a nest site. The process will start, she will, first of all, I should say, these scout bees fly out and they really look for dark openings. I'll sometimes see them and going up and down the sides of buildings looking for cracks or knot holes in sheets of plywood, things like that. So they're looking for a dark little opening, and if they find one, they inspect it and they go inside. And if it's, they'll tend to spend 10 to 30 minutes. A scout bee will tend to spend about 10 to 30 minutes inside this prospective site. And during that time, she'll make a number of walks all inside the cavity. These are representations of recordings I made with a nest box that I set up on the side of a dark hut with a piece of glass separating me from the box. And so I could track the bee, the scout bee, the first scout bee that found it. And what I saw is her first visit in, she walked around a little bit. 8th visit in, she walked around much like the first one. But by the 17th visit, she was exploring deep inside the cavity. And by her final visit, the 25th, she was comfortable walking and even doing a little bit of flying all around inside this box. So during this time period, she is measuring the volume of the cavity, the entrance size, the entrance height, and so forth. That's all a private affair because that's done by the bee herself on her own. Now she comes back to the swarm, and here she makes a public report of what she's found and uses the waggle dance to indicate the direction and the distance to the discovery she's made. And as we'll see, she also does the dance in a way that provides information about the quality of the site that she's found. I'll just do a little, I thought I'd play a little video, but I need to do something here. Optimize for video, I think it is. Oh yeah. Yep, there we go. I'll play this little video clip. Here we see a nest site scout performing a waggle dance on the surface of a swarm. I bet a lot of you have seen this. I'm always charmed by the fact that she just dances right over the back of her swarm mate. This bee found a very good nest site because she's a vigorous dancer, and you can see she's attracting the attention of a lot of other bees that are twisting and turning along with her as she goes through her circle. Oops. There we go. Now, the first person to study the dancing bees on swarms is this gentleman here, Martin Lindauer, lived from 1918 to 2008. And he got started in this investigations because he was a student with Karl von Frisch. He had been drafted into the German army in the late 1930s and managed to survive the Second World War because he was badly injured in a battle in Russia. And the rest of his corps went on to the Battle of Stalingrad, and only 3 men came back from that unit of 150 men. So he, by chance, escaped that high risk of death. So he came back, he was shipped back to Munich to have surgery done on his damaged arm. And while he was convalescing, the surgeon in the hospital got chatting with him. The surgeon learned that Lindauer had an interest in biology, and he recommended he go see the famous Professor Karl von Frisch at the University of Munich. And Lindauer did, and started looking at various projects, but the one that he's probably most famous for is the one I'm going to share with you now. It started one day when he came out of the Zoological Institute at the University of Munich in 1949. He saw that there was a swarm hanging in one of the bushes near the entrance of the institute. They have hives had hives of bees there at the Institute. And Lindauer was an excellent, superb observer. And so he paused and looked at the swarm, and he saw bees dancing on the swarm. And he thought, wow, that's odd. I didn't know they danced on the swarm. And then he saw something that was even more strange to him. He saw that some of these bees were kind of dirty looking. Some of them, it looked like they had dirt or literal dirt or dust in the hairs on their thorax, or red brick dust. Um, so he was wondering what's going on with these bees. Why are these are clearly bees that are not coming back from clean flowers. These must be bees that are poking around, looks like in broken buildings and things like that. So this was his first clue that bees use the waggle dance in a swarming situation to communicate about potential home sites. Now, you might wonder again, why were those scout bees coming back so dirty and dusty? Well, you have to remember the year, 1949. Here's a glimpse at what Munich looked like in that year. Munich, 1945. Those of you who know Munich, you'll know that these are the towers of the cathedral. It was heavily bombed. It was an important industrial city. And so by 1949, it was still piles of rubble. And Lindauer told me, as we'll see shortly, he was able to run around Munich freely because there were no tall buildings. Everything was bombed into pieces. Now here's what Lindauer did. He watched 20 swarms from the start to the finish, from the dancing, and he was able to gather data on the patterns of dancing by the bees. He couldn't get complete patterns, but he was able to get enough information by watching the dancing bees to make the following conclusions. Initially, bees on the swarm perform dances for multiple sites, multiple home sites. But before the swarm flies off to its new home, all of the dances indicate just one site. At this point, the swarm, once it's taken off, the swarm flies to the dance consensus site and moves in there. That's its new home. And this told Lindauer, this was excellent proof that the dances on swarms indicate possible homes. It also indicated to Lindauer that the bees have he didn't say democratic, I've forgotten the German word he used, but in essence, he pointed out that the bees have a democratic method of choosing a home. It doesn't come down to one or two bees. It's, in fact, as we'll see, that decision falls to the activity of several hundred scout bees. Now, you might be wondering about this claim that I've highlighted here. How did he know that the swarm flies to the dance consensus site and moves in? Well, this brings us to this map of the region of Munich where Lindauer was working. This was the Zoological Institute here. It's no longer here. It's been moved to the outskirts of the city. But at the time, it was here. Here's the main train station. If you've been to Munich, you've probably come into this place. But anyhow, the Zoological Institute was here. And this is where he was watching the swarms. They were coming out of the hives, and he would start watching the dancing. And he would see, okay, on this first swarm, he knew that the site was somewhere up here. He knew the approximate direction and distance. And then when the swarm lifted off and flew with the swarm, he was able to run beneath the swarm across the piles of rubble all the way to the swarm's destination. And so he could confirm that, oh yeah, they really move into a site, the site that was advertised by the dances. And he could do that for all of these, except for the one that flew across the train tracks and went down to what's called the fairgrounds down there. But so he had really good evidence that indeed the swarm flies to the dance consensus site. This was great. This was remarkable observing by his and recording. Now, I talked to Lindauer and I said, why didn't you, because he wrote a very nice, about 53-page paper describing his observations, but he didn't go any farther. That was published in 1955, and he never went back to the subject. And when I became a graduate student, I made contact with him and I asked him, why didn't you explore this topic more deeply? And he said, back in the 1950s, you have to remember the simple tools I had. I had a chair, I had a paintbrush, I had a stopwatch, I had my wristwatch, um, uh, and I had a notebook and I had a pencil, and that was it. And what he did is he did his very best. And the way he got his recordings or took his data, every time he saw a scout bee doing a dance, he would read her dance, the direction and distance information, and he'd put a dot of paint on her. So he'd know, okay, that's one bee that I've already watched. And then he'd go on and then look, and that would be the end of the observing of that bee. So he was only able to get a very rough picture. And so in the 1997, I decided to go back, and this was 50 years later, and take a deeper look at the scout bees debate. And of course, I had the benefit of new things, new methods, new tools. And one of the most important tools was I could make swarms using the queen tags, swarms in which every bee, and I'd make swarms of 4,000 bees, and every one of those bees was labeled for individual identification using a queen tag on the thorax and a paint mark on the abdomen. And to label 4,000 bees, if you have a couple of helpers, as I did, a couple of Cornell undergraduates, we could do that in about 2 days' work. They'd be very long days from morning to way into the night, but we could get all 4,000 bees labeled. And what this meant is that now I would get that swarm made, every bee labeled, and then I would mount it on a swarm mount over here. And how does the swarm mount work? Well, the queen is caged, so the queen cage is put here, and that causes the swarm to cluster against this board. And so the 4,000 bees have plastered themselves on the side of this board, and that means there's no back to this swarm. There's just a front to this swarm. And really, there's no sides to the swarm. It's because it's kind of like a pancake on the side of that board. And then I would put a screen over the outer surface of the swarm, and that would be and the swarm would form a layer of bees on that screen. And that's where the scout bees would do their dances. And they would now do their dances on this nice planar surface. And of course, I kept them well fed with feeder bottles up here. So that ensured that if I saw bees doing dances, they were dances for nest site scouts. Because sometimes bees in a swarm will get hungry, they'll run out of food, and then there will be dancing for food. So I supplied food so they would not need to do any dances for nest sites or food sources. Just dances for nest sites. So I did this detailed eavesdropping on this debate by the scout bees on several swarms. I'm going to take you now through what this debate looks like for one swarm. This was a debate that unfolded over 16 hours, spread over 3 days. It started on the 20th of July at 11 a.m. and it ended at 11:58 on the 22nd of July. So over about 3 days. And what each of these diagrams depicts is the pattern of dance activity on the swarm for a given time period. So this first time period was from like 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. on the 20th of July. And what this arrowy thing, this pointy thing here represents is the pattern of dance activity. Each arrow designates a site that's being advertised. So this pink arrow here labeled A, it refers to there was a site to the east. That's why it points to the east, as if you imagine a compass sign here. So there's a site to the east. The length of the arrow indicates the distance. So that site was about 2 kilometers away or 1.2 miles away. And the width of the arrow indicates how many bees during this 2-hour time period performed a dance advertising that site. And here's a scale bar for bees. So that was about 8 bees. So from 11 to 1, 8 bees performed a dance announcing or advertising the site to the east. Meanwhile, you can see there were other sites that were being advertised. There was one to the south, here's one to the south-southwest, here's one to the south-southeast, here's one to the east-southeast, north, etc. So that, and I was able to know how many bees were dancing for all these sites, again, because I had every bee was labeled for individual identification. Okay, now here's the pattern of dance activity from 1 to 3 p.m. Again, a site to the east is still being announced or advertised by dancing bees, but now we'll see there's some other sites that are being announced. There's a site G and a site H have been added to the collection of potential home sites. Now we look at 3 to 5 p.m. Now there's 38 bees danced, and still that site to the east is prominent, but the sites to the south and the southwest, B and G, they're becoming the most prominent, and that pattern of continued into the evening, 5 to 7 p.m. Dancing ended a little before 7, and again, the site to the south, B, and the site G to the southwest certainly are getting the most advertising. Next morning, 7 to 9, things picked up where they left off the previous day, largely in the sense that B and G are the most important sites, most vigorously advertised sites. A lot of the other sites have dropped out. And as we go from 9 to 11, we see that this continues. B and G were prominent, but you can see B is starting to slip behind the popularity of site G. That continued into 11 o'clock hour and beyond, with B, the blue site, fading, G, the other site, growing proportionately. But then it started raining, the whole thing shut down. And fortunately, the following morning, the rain had ended, and the bees started up their dancing, and every dance done by the scout bees that morning was for site G. And the swarm took off at 11:58, and it flew off in the direction of the southwest, which is what the scout bees had been indicating were their dances. So that gives us an overview of how this debate works. And I think when you step back and you think about it, I still am so thoroughly impressed by what we see here. We see that the scout bees have gone out, they've gotten information about various possible sites, and then they winnow it down to one site. And it turns out that agreement is on the best site, not just any site. So they're not just good at building an agreement, but it's an agreement on the best site. Now, how do I know that? How do I know it's for the best site? How do we know that swarms choose the best site of all the options that they find? Well, I know this because I did an experiment where I tested exactly, or addressed that exact question. And the way I could do this is I could go to a location, an island off the southern coast of Maine. Here we are, Boston, down here in Massachusetts. If you go north, you go up to New Hampshire and then into Maine, just cross the border into Maine, there's this island called Appledore Island in Maine. And it's where, by chance, Cornell University has a marine laboratory for undergraduate courses. And I had heard about this island, and I talked to the director, and I said, are there big trees on this island? And he said, no, mostly brush. I said, are there lots of houses? He said, no, not very many houses. The place has been abandoned for many years, except for our laboratory. So I said, can I come out and bring some swarms and do some experiments? And he said, yes, you're welcome to do that. So here's what I did. First of all, here's a look at what this island looks like. You can see it's covered with brush, no big trees. The nearest large trees with attractive nest cavities are 6 miles away. And you can see the mainland across the water, 6 miles across the water, way off there. That's too far for the scout bees to go searching. So no trees, nearest ones are too far away. And on this, so what I would do is I'd bring out to this island, one at a time, a swarm of bees. And I would give each swarm a multiple choice test. And when I would do this, I would set the swarm up on my swarm mount, which we had looked at in schematic form before. But here's what it actually looks like. It's this post with a board on it, little feeder bottles at the top. The queen is mounted on the board here, and the bees cluster against the board. And there's probably maybe hard to see, but there's a flat screen underneath that puts all the dancing bees on a nice planar surface. There's a video camera here for recording dancing, and all these wires that make this swarm looks a little bit like it's on in some sort of intensive care unit. But these are devices for microphones and temperature probes for certain experiments. Okay, so that's what the swarm looks like. Setup looks like. Oh, and these are windbreaks. It's very windy on the island, so protect the swarm from the wind. So the swarm is set up here in the center of the island for this experiment. And my multiple choice test was achieved by putting out 5 nest boxes in this fan-shaped array on this side of the island. And in this multiple choice test, Like with all multiple choice tests, there's one right answer or one good answer, and all the others are errors. And here's what I did. I, when I put out those 5 nest boxes, just go back to this, one of them is going to be an ideal nest site, and the other 4 are going to be okay nest sites. So it's not a trivial choice I'm asking them to make. It's not like night and day. It's asking them, can you choose the best out of the 5? And all 5 are actually acceptable. Now, here's how I made the boxes, adjusted their quality. Here's what one of the nest boxes looked like in this experiment. It's just a plywood box equipped with a small entrance. I could adjust the size of the entrance, but for this experiment, I gave a small entrance opening. And inside the box is this movable wall. I can adjust the volume, the nesting space available to the bees by either taking this wall out completely, and that gives them a 40-liter nesting cavity, or I can put the wall in here at 20 liters, or here at 15 liters, or here at 10 liters. For this experiment, I gave them a choice between one box was set at 40 liters, which was excellent, and the other 4 boxes were set at 15 liters, which is acceptable, but not ideal. And each box is put in this little orange hut because there's lots of gulls on the island, and I didn't want the gull poop all over my nest boxes. I didn't know if that would affect the attractiveness to the bees, so that each one was in a little shelter. Now, the question is, do swarms choose the best site? So again, it's a multiple choice test. And so I'll show you the results from 2 trials, from swarm 1 on this bar here and swarm 2 down here. The first, and what's recorded here is the number of bees, scout bees, visible at a nest box for each, which was measured every 15 minutes. So you can see that on this first swarm, trial 1, they actually found all of the mediocre boxes pretty quickly and early in the day. They didn't find the excellent one, which was way at one side of the array, until around noontime. And you can also see that interest didn't really build up strongly at any of these boxes. But once they found the good one, the really good one, boom, the number of scout bees grew rapidly at that box. And by the end of the day, they had reached a point where they were ready to take off, and they flew to that site. The second trial was even more interesting in the following sense, that in this one, again, they found these 2 mediocre boxes first, and around a little before noon here, a little after about 2 o'clock here, and they found the excellent box also around 2 o'clock. So this site got a head start, and it started building up. There was considerable numbers of scout bees building up at this box and at this box. But once they got going on this box, you can see as the numbers go up here, they go down here, and they're going down here, and they never really went anywhere with these 2 boxes. So again, there was a takeoff, and the swarm flew to this site. So they were, in this test, they were doing quite a good job, and did five runs of this test, and these did well. So what I want to mention or point out now is that what tells a swarm that they have chosen a site is not the agreement of dancing bees on the swarm. It's the buildup of a crowd of 10 to 15 bees outside the winning nest box. I call that the swarm has reached a quorum. Enough scouts are voting or expressing their interest in a site by continuing to visit it and hang out at it. And that, if that crowd reaches 10 to 15 bees outside outside a box, and there's lots more bees inside the box, somehow the scouts sense that that site has proven sufficiently popular with a lot of bees that they can choose that site. So they're not building a complete consensus, they're building a quorum for them to know when they should stop talking and start acting, so to speak. Okay. One thing I want to just to share with you a little of what it's like to do these experiments. I want to emphasize that rarely do these experiments work flawlessly at first. And that was the case in my best of n choice test experiment. The very first trial that I did, I'll explain that I did just as I said. I set up the swarm on the porch of the building here, and I put up my 5 nest boxes here. and I went down to the nest boxes, and I wanted to see if any bees were going to the nest boxes, and I didn't see any bees going to my nest boxes. But I came back, so I came back to the swarm, looked at on the swarm, and I saw lots of bees dancing, and where they were, and they were very enthusiastic dances too. But what they were pointing to was a location over here, opposite the direction of my home site, and my nest boxes. And what they had found was in a building over here. And this was rather dismaying, because when I came to work on Appledore, I was told by the director that I could go work almost everywhere on the island, but not over with these houses, and particularly not this house. And what is that house? Well, that is the house of the home of Rodney Sullivan. He's a lobster fisherman, and he doesn't he's he was a gruff guy. He and I got along pretty well, but he liked his privacy, very much liked his privacy. That's why he's had his house 6 miles out in the ocean here. And so it was with that's why, so I was told, just he doesn't want people around, so don't go over there. But I had to go over there to figure out what was going on with the scout bees. And when I got there, Rodney said, I got a problem. I got bees. And I didn't tell him they were mine, but I said, I can help you with that. And the solution was, he built a fire in his wood stove down here, smoked the scout bees out. Meanwhile, I climbed up the ladder. I did the dangerous job. I went up on the roof with duct tape and screening, and put a screen over the top of the flue of his chimney. And that solved that. That eliminated that alternative. And then the scout bees didn't find anything better than that, so they went to my nest boxes. I mention all that just to show you that you have to be adaptable when you're doing these field experiments. Well, now let's turn to the question of, what do the individual scout bees do to produce the collective choice of the best site? Because when you think about it, all we've looked at so far is the pattern of the buildup of interest, or buildup of the number of scout bees at the different sites, and then finally to reaching the quorum at one of them, and then moving to the site. But what actually happened? What did the scout bees do to produce that choice? And let's just review what happened here. Here's our winning site down here in the Southwest. It started out a very minor player. It was a minor player in popularity. 13% of the dancing bees were for that site. A few hours later, it grew to 33%. The next day, by the next morning, middle of the next morning, it was 62%, and it was getting close to 100%, but that didn't happen until the following day, after when the weather turned good again. So somehow they went from 13% to 100% of the scout bees were dancing for that site G. So one question is, the scouts' interest grows and grows for the best site. How did that happen? And equally important question is this: how does it that the scouts' interest fades for all the poorer sites? I mean, there is this site B, for example, to the south. It was a very popular site for quite a while, but by the end, nobody was advertising it. Nobody was performing dances to promote that site. So how did this interest for all the poor sites fade away? Well, let's look at these things. Well, here's a way to think of this process, this decision process. It's essentially a race between groups of scout bees to accumulate sufficient support for their site. And the simplest situation is, let's say there's just two sites, site A, which is a superb site, and site B, which is a so-so site. And let's say both sites have been discovered by scout bees. So each site has some supporters, scout bees for A, scout bees for B. Now, there's also on this swarm a pool of uncommitted scout bees. So the bees from site A, they're coming back from a superb site. So they make very long, strong dances, and I'll explain what I mean by that shortly. Whereas the bees coming back from site B, they perform feeble, short dances. And so just that difference in the strength of the dancing is going to cause many more of the uncommitted scouts to go out and inspect site A, and they will find it superb, and then they will dance for it strongly as well. Whereas site B is not going to, the dances for site B aren't as strong, and not as many scouts will go to that site, and they too will think it's not so good, and they will come back and they might dance a little, but not very much. And so that's how it's this differential advertising of the sites according to the quality of the site that biases the buildup at the best site in favor of the best site. So a key feature of the scout's decision making is dance strength is a function of site quality. So the support of the scout bees builds up fastest for the best site. And here's what I mean by the bees perform longer lasting dances for better sites. In one of these studies, I extracted information about the amount of dancing done by each scout bee, and that is expressed as the total number of dance circuits produced per scout bee. And I got a distribution. I set up, in this experiment, I set up two nest boxes, a 40-liter box, just two boxes, a 40-liter box, the dream home, and the 15-liter box, the fixer-upper. And I recorded the amount of dancing done by each scout bee. There were 41 bees whose dancing I recorded for the dream home and 37 bees that danced for the fixer-upper. And what we see here is a distribution of the total number of dance circuits produced per scout bee. And a dance circuit is a waggle run followed by a return. That's one dance circuit. And you can see the bees from the dream home, on average, they vary greatly. Some scout bees are not really into dancing very much, and others are very enthusiastic dancers. So there's a broad distribution for both of these distributions. But the dream home, the average number of dance circuits produced per scout bee was 90, whereas for the fixer-upper it was only 30, and a lot of bees did 0. So that's the kind of biasing. That's why the buildup and the race to build a quorum was in favor of the better sites, the best site that the bees have found. And here's a schematic way of thinking about this. It's schematic because we're just going to consider the simplest situation of a scout bees having to choose between two potential home sites. And I'll put over here, one of these sites has a smaller entrance than the other. So I'm going to call this one over here the better site and this the poorer site. And we'll say that the bees that dance for this site over here on the right is for the better site. We'll label those scout bees. We'll record them on the swarm as this blue symbol. We'll consider the bees dancing for the left hand site over here by the red symbol. And so let's say both sites are discovered at exactly the same time at 10 a.m. or the dancing starts for both sites at exactly the same time. And so there's one bee and one bee for each site. But the dancing represented by the blue bee, because her site is better, let's say it's 3 times, each of her dancing is 3 times stronger than the bee for the red site. Well, that means if we come back at 1 p.m., we're going to find 3 times as many bees dancing now for this site over here than for this site over here. And now I think you can see the thing just snowballs in favor of this better site, because now it's not just that each bee is dancing 3 times, each blue bee is dancing 3 times more strongly than each red bee, but there's now 3 times as many blue bees as red bees. And so this kind of positive feedback helps the whole decision-making process focus on the one best site. So by 4 p.m., almost every bee that's dancing is for this site. And there's also, so there's lots of bees here and almost no bees over here. And one other point I want to make through this diagram is that it is this buildup of scout bees at the site that tells the scouts, and I mentioned this again, but I'll emphasize it here. It's a buildup of a quorum or a critical mass of bees hanging out at this site that tells each of these bees that their site has been chosen. They don't follow the dances on the swarm. Oh, I can do that because I'm a human being and I can record the dances. I can see this, but they can't see that. What they can see is when they go to their site and they bump into a lot of other bees, we don't really know how they sense a quorum, but it may be looking and seeing lots of bees there or bumping into lots of other bees. Somehow they sense that this site has got a quorum. It's got a lot of bees visiting it. And that tells these bees at this site the decision has been made. And then these bees, once they sense a quorum at the site, They come back to the swarm, they stop their waggle dancing, and they start producing signals which get the swarm ready to move to the new home site. We'll come back to those signals in a little bit, but I do want to just cover this second question. We've looked at how the interest grows and grows to the best site. Let's now understand how this interest fades for all the poorer sites. In other words, why do the scout bees stop? Well, in general, why do scout bees stop dancing? Do scout bees compare sites and switch to better ones? Is that how a bee going to a lousy site learns that her site is lousy and she should stop advertising it? The answer is no. That's not how it works at all. What goes on here is it was kind of surprising, but this is how it works. When I followed individual scout bees, I found that 40 out of 40 of them ceased their own dancing without having followed dances by others and without switching to a new site. In other words, well, maybe I can show it more clearly this way. Say it more clearly. The scouts automatically lose their interest in dancing. It's like they don't keep going and going and going. They gradually lose their interest in dancing. And this decline and this loss of interest in dancing to advertise a site happens more rapidly in scouts from poorer sites. And that also helps bias the buildup to be stronger at the better sites. And so I didn't go through that in detail, but I hope it was clear enough. I want to come back now to this point. A quorum has been reached at one of the sites. Now what happens? How do the scout bees implement their decision? Let's see. So these bees, they know their site has been chosen. They've sensed the quorum. What are they going to do? Well, what happens now is the scouts from the winning site, the one where who have sensed a quorum, they return to the swarm cluster and they start to produce a new signal. It's called worker piping. And the message of this signal is to all of the other bees in the swarm that tells them, warm up your flight muscles, get ready to go. Because the scout bees are just a few percent of the bees. And the bees from the winning site are even only maybe 100 or so bees. So but they know that it's time to move the swarm to get ready. But in order for bees to fly, as you probably know, they have to have their flight muscles up to about our body temperature, up to about 35 degrees centigrade or 95 degrees Fahrenheit. And most of the bees in the swarm cluster have just been hanging out there. They have not kept their bodies warm. They've been very frugal with the honey that they're carrying. They don't want to burn up a lot of fuel, so they haven't been trying to keep their flight muscles warm and ready for flight. But this bee, when they hear a bee come back and start piping, they will know that it's time to warm up their flight muscles. And let's see if let me just make sure that it's optimized for, yeah, it's still optimized. I'm going to play the video clip. You're going to see a piper running over the swarm surface 16 minutes before takeoff. I'm holding a microphone over that running scout bee, and you can hear her piping. You can also hear gulls in the background. You can see there's still some bees dancing on the swarm. Let's play it again. A lot happening in this image. So what you're seeing is the side of the swarm mounted on my board, protected by the orange windshield or windscreens. She's going to come from this top. She has sensed a quorum at her site, and she's telling the other bees it's time to get ready to warm up their flight muscles in preparation for moving to the site. So this is 16 minutes before takeoff. To pause to do a waggle dance there, and she's going back to hiking. Yeah. Okay. Now, you and I are hearing that sound because the microphone picks up the airborne vibration. The other bees in the swarm are feeling that sound. She's pushing up against the other bee. She's going on, even though it's not so obvious. Every time she makes that squealing, piping sound, she's pushing her thorax against other bees. And so she's transmitting the signal through body-to-body contact. But it's very handy that it makes a loud sound that we can hear too. Okay. And this piping signal tells the other bees to warm up their flight muscles, because the temperature, the thorax muscle temperature, has to be greater than 35 degrees centigrade or about 95 degrees Fahrenheit for it to contract fast enough to support flight in a bee. And this warm-up process is illustrated by these two images taken with a thermovision camera. So in other words, the darkness or the brightness of the bee that you see here indicates the bee's body temperature. And you can see, so white is hot, bees hot enough to fly. Their thorax temperature is up around 40 degrees centigrade. And there's a few of them, this bee, and that's about it. And this was 15 minutes before takeoff. So you can see the swarm really does have to get its act together. It has to get everybody warmed up. But 1 minute before takeoff, there's been piping going on for the last 15 or 30 minutes. And now you can see that every bee thorax you can see is, in a sense, shiny hot, is white hot. And it's not literally white hot, but it's white hot in the image. And then thus every bee in the swarm is now prepared to launch into flight. And so the non-scouts in the swarm have warmed up their flight muscles in response to the piping by the scouts. We did some experiments where we'd set up a swarm, if we'd cage some of the non-scouts in a swarm in a little cage, so they couldn't be contacted by the piping bees, and they did not warm up their thorax. They did not warm themselves up. So that tells us that, yeah, the piping, they have to be really contacted by a piper to know when to warm up. And this pretty much brings me to the end of my talk, because at this point, I'll just go back to this. Once these bees are warmed up, 1 minute before takeoff, the scout bees from the winning site who have been running around doing the piping, they sense that the right moment has come when everybody is warm enough to take off, and then they make another signal called the buzz run, which causes the swarm cluster to break up and to launch into flight. And if we had more time, I could give you a whole talk on how the scouts, the 2% or so of the bees in the swarm that know where the chosen site is, how they steer everybody else to the chosen site. That's a fascinating subject, but it's a subject for another talk. I want to end my presentation by mentioning that there's a couple of practical tips for beekeepers that have come out of this work. One is that when you come to collect a swarm, listen for piping. Put your ear up next to the swarm to see if it's about to take off. And if you do hear this loud, continuous piping sound, then lightly spray the swarm with water. It will cool the bees, and it will prevent the swarm's takeoff. So that's a little practical thing that you can take home from this talk. Listen, come to the swarm cluster, put your ear up next to it. Put your ear up, with just a couple of inches from the swarm. You won't even need that, probably, be that close. If you hear piping, get out a spray bottle with water. Otherwise, it's about to take off. It's going to take off within 15 minutes, I'd say. I've only been able to touch on some parts of this whole story of how the bees choose their home and move to the home. It's a wonderful, it's an amazing story. It's probably the most amazing part of the biology of honeybees, at least their social system, that I know. And it still boggles me to think that the bees are this well organized to really work as a information processing unit, find options, make a choice, and make a good choice for their new home. So if you'd like to learn more, I took the time to write this book, and I think it's it tells the whole story up to what I had learned as of 2010. We've learned a few more things since then, but I can recommend this book. Of course, I'm the author. Okay, I guess I should stop share at this point and do questions. So, how do you want to do the Q&A? Should I scroll through the Q&A?
Yes. Dr. Seeley, yes, at the bottom of your screen, just open that up. It looks like there's several questions up there for you to review.
Okay, I'll start at the top. Do the bees measure the thickness of the box in any way by measuring the outside tube? You know, I forgot to talk about that. I don't know the answer to that, and I'm doing an experiment this summer to looking at if insulation or the thickness of the walls or just the insulation is important to the scout bees. I don't know at this point. Second question, when do scout bees start searching for a home site? Is it days before the swarm leaves or after the swarm is issued? Excellent question, and I didn't talk about that in this talk. It actually starts several days in advance. The scout bees will go out several days in advance. And I know that from an experiments I did with Dr. Juliana Rangel as part of her PhD thesis work. We went out to Appledore. We had colonies living in observation hives, which were very strong. And we put out nest boxes before those colonies cast their swarms, and we would see scout bees starting to look for, explore our nest boxes 2 or 3 days in advance. Next question, will a swarm move once or twice before moving to a new location? It's usually once, but sometimes they will have to make an interim stop, probably because the queen needs a rest. She can't keep flying, so they need to stop. And what they do is once they sense the queen is missing, they don't smell her, and people have done experiments that show it's just the queen substance pheromone that tells the bees in the swarm that the queen is present. If they don't smell that, they stop moving forward, they search for the queen cluster around her, and then they will resume their move in a day or a few hours or a few days. Were there no bees on the island before you did your experiment? Yes, that is correct. There were no honeybees on that island. There are about 15 species of solitary bees, but no honeybees. Did you leave your bees there? No, I did not leave my bees there. That would have been a death sentence. There's not enough forage on the island to support a colony of bees. Is there any place to order your new book that is signed by me? I'm not, no. The best I can offer is to have you mail it, write me an email, and I can send you my mailing address, and you want to mail the book to me with, we can work out to have that done, have me sign it and send it back. So when you move a swarm from a tree to your box, what prevents them from going to their chosen home? Very important question. Glad you asked that. The answer is that if you put good combs in your box that you're providing for the new home, that anchors them there. The only time I've seen them move out of when it was of a box that contained combs was in one experiment where I had finished the experiment, and I took down the swarm before they had moved to their new home on the island, but I took it down when they were evidently near the end of their preparations to move to the new home. So I shook the bees into the box, and those little scout bees from the winning site, they would have nothing to do with this. They didn't like this at all. They went into my nest box, or the nucleus box where I had put the swarm, and they went in there and they did the piping and they did the buzz running, the signal to get them out of there and to go to the new home. And they got them out of the box and they took them back down, to the site where they had chosen. So sometimes that happens, and I think the best thing you can do when you're capturing a swarm and you want them not to fly away is to find the queen and put her in a queen cage, because they can't leave then. Okay. If you're going to place a swarm trap in your apiary to catch your own bees if they swarm, what distance from the parent hive? Is it best to place the trap near a forage site? Very important question as well. You actually do not want to put your bait hive or swarm trap in your apiary. I've tried that for years and I never caught any swarms, but then I started putting my bait hive or swarm traps a few hundred yards from my apiary, and then I would catch swarms. So there's something going on there that they don't like to live either near their original home, or they just don't like to live near where there's a lot of other colonies. It looks like they try to space themselves out. So you have to, clear recommendation, don't put your bait hives in your apiary. And the bees don't care if the bait hive is near a forage site or not, because they can get, where they nest doesn't matter a whole lot to their ability to forage. They can fly far and wide to get their food. So the nest, when they choose a nest site, they're looking for a site that provides them good protection, good space. They're not looking for a place with rich forage. I had a swarm that congregated on a high branch that was out of reach. So I sprayed a lower branch with Swarm Commander, and the swarm actually moved to the lower location. I was able to capture them. Did I get lucky? I think you partly got lucky because your timing was good, um, but yeah. But I don't think you were entirely lucky. That Swarm Commander is producing, it's a simulation of the attraction, the assembly pheromone of honeybees. So somehow the bees picked up a very strong signal of that and decided to move, which is actually pretty remarkable. But it worked, I see. If you use a deep brood box for a swarm trap, is it better to include frames? Or does that confuse the scout bees in measuring volume? Ah, you guys ask such good questions. Um, it, it is good to put frames of drawn comb in a bait hive or swarm trap. And does it confuse the scout bees in measuring volume? Well, it doesn't. Apparently what goes on is if a scout bee finds a potential home site that is already equipped with combs, that tells her that she doesn't need to check out the volume for its suitability. This is a pre-approved home in a sense. And so no, those combs don't mess up the decision, the assessment of the site, because the bee can make a much simpler assessment. This is proven to be a chosen site. Any future plans to write more books? Well, I have written, after I wrote Honeybee Democracy, I wrote a book on bee hunting called Following the Wild Bees, which is a fun read. And then more recently, I've written a book called The Lives of Bees, the untold story of the honeybee in the wild. And that's the subject of one of my later talks for this meeting. So I'll mention that as well. That's a really important, I think that's a book, well, maybe I'm being too strong a statement, but I think it's a book that every beekeeper should read because it's important to know how honeybees live in nature so we can better understand what we're doing with the bees when we're keeping them under our management. How long did it take you to understand the waggle dance? Not very long. I read a little book by Karl von Frisch called The Dancing Bees. And, oh no, it's called The Dance Language and Orientation of Bees. It's a little paperback book. It's sold by Cornell University Press, by the way. And it explains how you read the dances. You just have to, yeah, it's a little hard to describe in words, but if you get a hold of that book, or even if you read any of them, most of the good bee books, they have a picture in there that will show you how to read the dance. All you need is a stopwatch and an ability to visualize the angles. If she's dancing straight up, you want to record that, or straight down, or some angle in between. I usually reference it to a clock face. I'm saying that bee's dancing at 3 o'clock, or whatever. So yeah, didn't take really long, but it does take practice like anything. Yeah, good. Well, I don't know where we stand in the time, so let me know. And I think it looks like we've got. I don't know. I think I've gone through all the questions, at least all the questions that I see. Is there anything else I should be doing, or should I be signing out at this point?
This one right here. Would you fill the box with frames?
Okay, Dr. Seeley, it says when you're trying to...
when you're catching a swarm in your box, would you fill the box with frames, or would you just put a few frames in?
Oh, I would fill the box with frames. And the reason is a lot of times swarms are large, and we have to remember these bees are all primed to start building combs. So if you've left an open space in that box, they're going to fill up that open space with more combs, and it's going to be a mess. So you want to fill that box with combs if possible. You might wonder, well, what are they going to do with all that honey that they've got in their stomachs? They're just going to dump it in the combs. It'll give them you give them a huge and wonderful head start if they can move into a full set of combs.
Dr. Seeley, I have kind of a follow-up question to that. Typically, when a beekeeper catches a swarm, we find it hanging on the branch, and we shake it into a box full of combs. Does that supersede that scout process, or are they still likely to not take the one that they're in and go out to where the scouts are?
Almost always they'll take the new home that you've provided, because it's all, given that it's full of combs, it's superior to the one that's hollow and out in some tree or some wall of a building. only once have I seen a swarm that I've put into one of my boxes at the end of the experiment. Only once have I seen the scout bees go into the box that I put them in, rouse the bees to come out and fly to the site on the island.
They'll take the dream almost. Thank you so much.
Hey, Thomas, can you make sure you put David Clark back as the host? Just right-click on my name and make host.
And Dr. Seeley, before you go, I want to thank you so much. We'll be hearing more from you during this conference, but I wanted to share a quote from Honeybee Democracy. It says, by operating without a leader, the scout bees of a swarm neatly avoid one of the greatest threats to the good decision-making by groups, a domineering leader. Such an individual reduces the group's collective power to uncover a diverse set of possible solutions to a problem, to critically appraise these possibilities and winnow out all but the best one. I read your book, and I strongly encourage all beekeepers to read that book. I also strongly encourage all leaders to read that book because it's got some fantastic lessons in it.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your interest. And I'll reconnect with you.